Hello, my name is Kathy Williams and I'm an antenatal teacher and doula based in Bedfordshire in the UK. I have been working with families and women and their partners as they prepare to meet their baby for the last 15 years, a lot of whom had a previous caesarean. And so I'm going to share some of the information with you that I share with them. So this is what we're going to cover today. We're going to look at what are the benefits, why people choose home birth after caesarean, what are the issues. We're going to look at avoiding another caesarean. We're going to look at all the issues around rupture and the implications for that on your care. We're going to look at, weighing it all up and the decision making, what your rights are, how to go about arranging a home birth, also how to go about arranging birth in a midwife-led unit, because many women sometimes they're looking for a home birth because actually they want a midwife-led unit. So we're looking at out of hospital birth with a focus on home, and we'll finish up with some stories. So why do the women that I know, why do they consider having a birth at home after caesarean? Well, some of them, they had planned a home birth the first time round, and so they looked at all the benefits of being at home, what all the research showed, and how much better outcomes can be of birth at home, and so they know what the positives are and some of the negatives about being in a hospital, and the reasons they chose the home birth last time are still valid. For some women, they might have planned a hospital birth first time round, and now they've experienced giving birth and they know how their bodies work, how that they wanted it to be quiet and dark and not interrupted. They didn't like the smells, that they were very alert to what was going on around them, and they realise that actually their body works best when they are at home. And feeling in control obviously is a really key thing, particularly if you've had a birth that didn't go quite as well as you wanted, and you felt there were aspects of that where the feeling of not being in control was the most difficult, and planning a home birth can help with that. Also that women who can't get the birth they want in hospital. So, for example, they want to use the pool, they're being told, no, can't use the pool, whereas at home, then get in the pool. The idea of having a midwife with you all the time can really help you with how labour progresses, and you're not guaranteed that in hospital, whereas at home birth, then you should do, again, as I said, midwife-led unit. Also, women feel that they would be pressured to have standard care if they were in hospital, and we're going to talk about that in a bit, and just want to give their bodies a chance. So what are the benefits? Well, it's really great. We've got some research there. The reference at the bottom there, there was a big birthplace study that was undertaken in 2010, tens of thousands of births, and the first research that was published in 2011 looked at low risk women and outcomes for at the different places of birth, and home birth came out really, really well, and the recommendation now is that, particularly for second timers, everybody with a low risk shouldn't be on a normal labour ward, basically, and first or second time, the outcomes are a lot better not on a labour ward. But they've done a few follow-on studies, and the latest one has been about women having planning a vaginal birth after caesarean, and they're comparing labour ward, hospital, or obstetric unit, and all the same thing. They're comparing hospital to home, and they haven't included midwife-led unit in this, presumably they didn't have the numbers to do that. And it's really, really interesting. So from that study, the women that planned the home birth had 82% of them had a straightforward birth, compared to those who planned a hospital birth only had 53%. And it's all about where you planned, not where you actually gave birth. Now, some of the women who planned the hospital birth had other complicating factors, so it's not quite as straightforward, but even the study looked at that, and even when there is, you take out the complicating factors, then those that had planned a home birth had much higher outcomes. The straightforward birth, obviously, that precludes those who have any sort of intervention, but those who got a VBAC, so I hate using the word successful VBACs, I'm just talking those that the planned VBACs that ended up in VBACs. If women that planned to give birth at home, 88% of them got their VBAC, compared to only 75% in hospital. It is worth noting that, you know, you're still planning a vaginal birth after caesarean, you still have even if you go to a hospital, you still have a 75% chance of having, of getting your VBAC. The research showed that there was less chance of interventions among those who planned the home birth. And we're going to talk, there was no difference in poor outcomes for babies, it was the same, but we'll look at that later. We know that women planning home births, we talked about, have more control, and one of the big benefits is you get midwife-led care, and there's lots of research to show that midwife-led care leads to great outcomes. You can choose to go to hospital anytime. A little quick history, positive history of home birth and why we have our cultural negativity towards home birth. So obviously, for centuries, women have been giving birth at home, and they usually would have a local birthing woman. We would now call her a doula, but a local one would come round, and then when birth was cracking on, they'd call the midwife, and if needed, the GP, because you were paying for all of this. After the Second World War, we had the NHS came, and more hospitals were built, and we started to see an increase in hospital births. And one of the reasons was that because women, we had rationing for many, many years after the end of the Second World War, and women who could, who went into hospital didn't use their rations up. So by doing that, there was more food for their family. So that was a choice that many women gave. But still many were at home. I was born in 1968 at home because that's what you all did. Even breech and twins weren't necessarily guaranteed to a place at hospital. However, in 1970, there was a Peel report, and it found that the number of the perinatal mortality, so that's death during pregnancy, birth, and the month after birth, the rate of perinatal mortality had dropped drastically in line with the rise in hospital births. So it was decided that hospital births were obviously safer, and provision should be made for 100% of births to take place in hospital. And from then we saw a dramatic decline in the number of home births. However, in 1980, Marjorie Chu produced a book called Safer Birth. She was a statistician lecturer and working with medical students, she set undergraduates, she set them the task of proving that hospital birth was the safest place, as she thought. And when they all came back and said, oh no, actually it's the opposite, she was like, oh, what's going on? And so she went and looked into it, and she found that home birth was at least as safe as hospital birth. What she found was that the rate of decline in neonatal mortality matched the rate of decline in poverty, and the increased standard of living was largely the cause of the improvements in neonatal mortality. What she found was those that were living in poverty had the same level of neonatal mortality. Perinatal mortality. She also found that when you separate out planned home births from unplanned home births, that made a big difference to the outcome. So when you mix the two together, it changed the statistics. And unplanned home births include very premature babies, babies born before arrival, perhaps that had medical conditions, ones where there were undisclosed pregnancies, so young mums who hadn't told anybody they were pregnant, and those that hadn't accessed antenatal care at all. And they're all factors that are much more likely to have issues. And when you separated that birth, she found that all low risk, medium risk, high risk birth at home was at least as safe as birth in hospital. It was only the very high risk that birth in hospital had better outcomes. And here we can see how it's dropped off. It's starting to increase a little bit, but still not great. What happened to the caesarean rate? Well, here we are, and you can see how the caesarean rate has massively gone up. And yes, perinatal mortality has gone down, but not the same, not as drastically in line with the high rise in caesareans. But that means there's an awful lot of women out there planning VBACs. So there are two real issues: the uterine rupture and also the risks associated with a repeat caesarean, both on during the second caesarean and on future pregnancies. The Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists have produced green top guidelines, and I've extensively used their birth after caesarean guidelines. Two of their recommendations that women should be made that successful VBAC has the fewest complications, and the greatest risk of adverse outcomes occurs where there is a planned VBAC that results in emergency caesarean. So you would think, therefore, that everything should be done to make sure that your planned VBAC becomes a VBAC. It does say in that first one that the chance of VBAC success or failure, their words, is an important consideration, and what they mean when choosing the mode of delivery. So what they're meaning by that is if you're just deciding between going for another caesarean or a VBAC. This is what their research in their guidelines. If you've had a previous VBAC or previous vaginal birth, then your chance of having a vaginal birth are really, really high. So that's very positive. If your previous caesarean was for malposition, so breech, you have a really high chance of having a VBAC. If you are taller, I have no idea why that is. If you are taller, you're more likely to have a VBAC. And if you are white, just shows institutional racism, unfortunately, is rife in our medical care system. You are less likely for your VBAC to end up in a VBAC if you are over 30, have a high BMI, or a bigger baby. Now, I find this really interesting, having a high-ish BMI myself and having my babies over 35, because let's think, which are the three categories that have some of the highest involvement with an obstetrician? It's those three, and we do know that midwife-led care has better outcomes than obstetric-led care. So is it because those are actually confounding issues, or is it because they're getting close to scrutiny? So, want your VBAC to stand the greatest chance of having a VBAC? Well, we've got lots of research that shows us what gives you the best chance of avoiding a caesarean. And I'm just going to compare this now to what the standard care model is for a woman planning a VBAC. So research shows that you reduce your chance for a caesarean if you plan a birth in a home or at a birth centre. Standard care, labour ward. Research shows that arriving in the labour ward later in labour reduces your chance of having a caesarean. I'm just going to flick through these because they're going to see a nice little pattern coming here. So everything that we know reduces your chance of having a caesarean is the exact opposite of what standard care for a woman planning a VBAC is. So this is something that you can talk to your care provider about. You say, I know that from the Green Top guidelines, the best outcomes for my baby are if my vaginal birth, my planned vaginal birth ends up being a vaginal birth. And therefore, I am going to decline all your aspects of your standard care or whatever ones that you choose. All of those are optional to you. It's your birth, particularly in the UK. So you can choose which ones of those that you accept and decline. Right, quickly can talk now about uterine rupture. So this is a big thing, isn't it? This is what is a big worry. 1 in 200, which is 0.5%, is a very common statistics that's included. That does mean, just based on those statistics, that 99.5% chance of no rupture. So you're doing all those precautions that increase your chance of having a caesarean for no chance of rupture, for 0.5% chance of rupture. There are a number of issues to do with the studies around rupture and how fast and how common rupture is. And one of the big things is that they muddled up rupture, which is a terrible word really. It sounds like an explosion, but rupture means that there is a hole in the uterus, and sometimes it's a small hole and sometimes a bigger one. But studies have conflated instances where there is rupture, where the hole goes through the uterine wall, and dehiscence. And dehiscence is like separation of the scar. Sometimes in some of the studies it's been noted and it's been counted as rupture when there has been an instance of this slight separation of scar tissue. So I don't mean, you know, this is scar tissue. And it's been noted when the woman's had a caesarean, another caesarean. And sometimes that's been for a totally unrelated reason. It does mean there's an awful lot of women out there who may well have had a slight separation of scar tissue, but because she didn't have a caesarean, we don't know. So it could be a very normal part of what happens, and it may not be an indication it goes on to rupture. It means that any research that includes scar dehiscence or separation of the scar in with rupture statistics is not robust, because it's not including all the ones we know. Also, rupture studies include studies around uterine rupture. Some of them include women who are not pregnant. So they've had fibroids or a car accident. Pregnant women not in labour. Women in labour but haven't got a scar on their uterus, so they haven't had a caesarean. That's more likely to happen where there has been uterine stimulation. So they've been drugs to speed up labour or start labour off. And women who are planning VBAC who've had their labour speeded up. Also, different types of scars, and when we do know that a classical incision makes a big difference, is a higher chance of rupture. So if that's muddled in, that will change the statistics, and different types of stitching up as well. So all these things can muddle up the research. So let's dig a bit further into the stats. Enkin et al. Is a book, Effective Care in Pregnancy. It is a really, really well-respected book, and it's updated regularly. and excluding symptomless wound breakdown, which is that scar dehiscence, the rate of reported rupture ranges from 0.9 to 0.22. So it's a lot, you know, that's quite a huge range. And that's for women with one baby, head down, who is having a planned vaginal birth after a previous that transverse lower segment caesarean section. So, and they then go on to say, if you put that in perspective, there are other obstetric emergencies that could happen to anybody that are much higher, that we don't strap women to a bed to, for a monitor to, that we don't say you can't get in the water, we don't say you need a cannula in. And all of these things that they've put there are emergencies. Let's have a look at the studies in the Green Top guidelines. They did have some studies there that did separate out that were just rupture, and were they separated out those that were induced or had their labour speed up, and those that weren't. So where there was actual rupture, no induction or augmentation of labour, the rates there were 0.36, 0.15 and 0.13. So that's even lower than the 0.5. So that's between 1 and 3 in 1,000 and 3.6 in 1,000. So that's a lot less than 1 in 200. So there's your chance of no rupture. So you're talking really, really tiny, and balancing that up, that the better outcomes for babies is where there is a planned vaginal birth that ends up in a vaginal birth. The birthplace study that I mentioned early on, that had comparing the home, those giving birth at home with vaginal birth after cesarean and those in hospital, they're 0.27. So very similar. So let's have a bit of a comparison. So we used amniocentesis. It's where they, if they're a suspected Down syndrome baby, they insert a needle in early pregnancy, take some amniotic fluid, and they can give you a better indication of whether your baby's Down syndrome or not. They're much better tests now. This was considered a very acceptable risk, and it was more than double the chance of rupture. Cord prolapse, which was mentioned before. Even your chance of having a hysterectomy with a repeat caesarean, and that's in the Green Top guidelines, 1%. That's considered an acceptable risk, but your 0.5 or less, they're saying, oh, we need to have all these other things in place. So why is it like that? Well, just having a little think about it from the obstetrician's point of view. A unit with 5,000 births, approximately 840 of those will be vbacs. So they'll see in the whole hospital, there'll be between 1 and 2 ruptures a year. And that's a scary thing for an obstetrician to come across. And obviously it won't be the same obstetrician, hopefully for them. Over 6 years in that hospital, there will be 1 baby that dies, but 17 years before 1 dies because of rupture. But however, the obstetrician, if it's them that was dealing with the rupture, worrying that mother and baby are going to die, they're not going to remember the thousands of others that gave birth with no problem. They're going to remember that one where it was really scary for them. Most of those that had vbacs that turned out that were vbacs, they won't even have seen. They never see the normal, straightforward births. They don't see the lovely water births, the lovely calm home births. Their job is to save the day and not support the normal. So there was a study that was Optibirth study by Professor Cecilia Bigley in Dublin, Trinity College Dublin, and she looked at the countries with high VBAC rates and countries with low VBAC rates, and what they did, and then did some interventions in those with low VBAC rates to see if they could increase the number of VBACs. And one of the interventions they did was some training for obstetricians, and they found when they presented the obstetricians with what the rupture stats were, many of them didn't believe it because it wasn't their experience, because they don't get to see all the thousands and thousands of normal births. So it's worth bearing in mind that they're very genuine. All the midwives and obstetricians I've met are very, very genuinely want to do the best they can for you and your baby. It's worth knowing that their knowledge and experience has limits. So take their knowledge, but also balance it that there's some things they don't have knowledge about. So just a bit about avoiding rupture, because it's worth knowing. So avoiding having your labour induced, and the best way is avoiding having your labour induced or speeded up, having a home birth. You have a reduced chance of rupture if you have these things. It doesn't mean to say that you would definitely rupture. The rates of rupture, remember, are still very slow. Just a note about induction. We're doing about home birth really, but it does come up, and women then feel, oh, my home birth's going out the window. Induction is associated with a higher rate of rupture. Many units do offer a Foley catheter, which is like a balloon inserted into your cervix that stretches your cervix. Do bear in mind it's worth talking what will happen if this doesn't work. So common reasons for induction: going past your due date, big baby, older mum. The research around the benefits of going for induction or waiting, there really isn't much difference. So it's worth looking at going away and looking into that, and making it, don't necessarily just accept the induction. If you accept a caesarean instead of induction to avoid that higher risk of rupture, you don't have to do it exactly when they suggest. They're very likely to say 40 weeks or 41 weeks. If you want to give your baby longer, you're really not going to be doing such a big risk. If you look at the research, you'll see. And rates of stillbirth are not quite, I think Sarah Wickham, who, midwife and lecturer, says the risks of stillbirth are smaller and later than is often said. So how are they going to find out about signs of rupture? Often they talk about the baby's heart rate, and that's why you need the monitoring, which is why you need to be in hospital. But there are other signs. Signs to do with the mum, so how she's feeling, the pain, your pulse, your blood pressure, and occasionally vaginal bleeding. Some say that the signs of the mother will come first. And I've heard that from experienced midwives and obstetricians, and that baby's heart rate is actually a late sign. So having somebody with you that is able to observe these other maternal factors is really important. It is down in some of the research that in very, very rare cases there may be no maternal signs. I did find that in a piece of research, but it included so many other different people, not just women having vbacs with a lower segment caesarean section scar. So it's, I think, take that with a bit of caution. So continual monitoring is often recommended to detect the fetal well-being. There's lots of research that shows that continual fetal monitoring is no better at improving outcomes than intermittent monitoring. And intermittent oscillation, that's listening in. So listening in with the ear trumpet, the pinard, or the dopler, which is the one they use to listen into the baby's heartbeat during your antenatal checks. So research shows no better, but the continual fetal monitoring increases your chance of having a caesarean by 50%. It does allow the heart rate to be linked to the contractions, and it does give a paper trace that can be shared and used if there is litigation. However, there Also have discrepancies in how the trace is interpreted. There can be concerns over every dip. It does limit mobility. And there can be massive fear when you lose the heartbeat. That's because the mother's moved. I've been there with women where oh no, there's no baby's heartbeat, and it's just the baby's moved down and the monitor's no longer picking it up, but everybody then has fear. Masses more interruptions. You have the midwife checking it, you have the senior midwife coming in every hour to check it, you have the obstetrician coming in every 2 hours to check it. And it means that the focus ends up being on the machine and on the woman. And you really see that as a doula, the massive fear that is focused on the machine. They're waiting for something to go wrong. So let's have a look what the Green Top guidelines say about continuous electronic fetal monitoring. So they advise that continuous electronic fetal monitoring done for the duration commencing at the onset of contractions, regular contractions, so right away from the beginning of labour, which is why they say go into hospital early in labour, which again is another factor that will increase your chance of having a caesarean. This is evidence level D. One of the great things about doing these guidelines is they tell you what the evidence is. So let's have a look. What is evidence level D? Evidence level D is evidence level 3 or 4, or extrapolated evidence for studies rated as 2+. So level 3 is case studies and case reports, and level 4 is expert opinion, so not based on research. This recommendation, because we've already talked about what the research says about electronic fetal monitoring, there isn't research that says it improves outcomes. So it is purely case studies and expert opinion. Go back, do you remember I said that the Green Top guidelines had the recommendations for best outcomes for if you plan a vaginal birth that ends up in a vaginal birth? That is evidence level B. So that is based on good, solid research. So it's worth bearing in mind these two. So the research saying that the better outcomes end up in a vaginal birth is higher than the evidence around the recommendation to have continual monitoring. So I hope that gives you confidence that you are not putting your baby at risk by maximising your baby's chance, or your chance of avoiding a caesarean birth for your baby. Often people say, oh, you can't have your baby at home. If you ruptured, you won't be able to get into hospital. How long you have really does depend on how early the rupture is detected. So having another midwife with you all the time is a good idea, who can spending time with you and watching you. Also how big it is, how fast you're bleeding. There are lots of different complicating factors. The gold standard of time from decision to do any caesarean, so not just as a result of rupture, to baby being born is 30 minutes. So it can be as little as 10 to 20 minutes, which would be ideal if you're having a rupture, but not all maternity units have an anaesthetist actually located in the maternity unit. They have to go and get an anaesthetist from somewhere else. So only you know how far you have to travel, and whether, because if your midwife suspected there was rupture, she would be phoning in, they would be preparing the theatre, and you would go straight there, and that would be the time that they would, same, so there wouldn't be too much difference depending on how far away you live. But remember, the chance of rupture is really tiny. I like this quote from Angela Horn on her wonderful home birth website, and there can be little doubt that a hospital is the safest place to have a uterine rupture, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the safest place or the only place for all mothers to have a VBAC. We're balancing things. Also in the Green Top guidelines, women should be informed that the absolute risk of birth-related perinatal death associated with VBAC, so your chance of your baby dying during VBAC, is extremely low, and it's comparable to the risk for a nulliparous woman in labour. So that means a woman having her first baby. So your chance that your baby will die is the same as any woman going into labour with her first baby. So if you have an obstetrician that says you're putting your baby's life at risk, it's no greater risk than a woman having her first baby at home. And the birthplace study showed that there was no difference between the number of babies died with home births compared to hospital births or midwife-led unit births. Very few babies die in the UK during birth. It's great. It does unfortunately happen. But I think that's a great one to know. I'm now going to talk about, so that was talking about babies dying. What about it not being good for the baby in terms of poor outcomes? Well, let's have a look at the reasons for transferring from home to hospital. So you can see that most of the transfers, so these are from that birthplace study follow-up that compared VBAC at home or a hospital. Most of the transfers were for slow first stage or slow second stage. It is a high rate of transfer, 56.7%. It is high, but 100% of those who planned a VBAC in hospital transferred in. Transferring in is very, very, very rarely. You can see none of these are absolute emergencies. The postpartum hemorrhage, which is after the birth, is the only one that is an absolute rush. But the midwives are able to deal with postpartum hemorrhage at home, and is not that different from other women. I've separate out because now we can look just at those that transferred for the baby's well-being, and again you can see that the numbers are really small. So the babies are not having trouble at home. Very few of them are having trouble, and you can see that those that transferred because the baby wasn't well after the birth was 0 for those having the first VBAC. So the number of babies that needed to travel, and these were 800 and something home births, the number that needed to travel in was less than 8. That's due to the baby not being well. Now, it's called, baby not being well is called morbidity. So that's not death, that's mortality. This is morbidity, is not being well. The follow-up study from the birthplace that looked at difference between VBAC at home and at hospital were pains to point out that their chance of poor outcomes for babies with oh sorry, I didn't mean to do that. That was a 2 to 3% chance of poorer outcomes, and they put that in their abstract and they put that in their conclusion. Well, they didn't put what they put in the middle. That's exactly the same rate of morbidity and with the baby not being well as those who had the planned hospital birth. So there were no difference between those who had the planned VBAC at home or the planned VBAC in hospital. For those having their caesarean, the morbidity rate is 4 to 5%, so higher. So again, if you plan plan a VBAC that ends up being a VBAC, it is better for your baby. So the research, and this study showed there was no difference in terms of the outcomes for babies, but do you remember a much higher chance of actually having a straightforward birth. So how do you balance it all out? Okay, a lot, as you know, rupture seems to be the only thing that is talked about. And you often are balancing out, you know, the chance of rupture against avoiding another caesarean. But there are an awful lot of other things that come into your decision-making process that you need to consider and that you will be weighing up. And these are not things that are in the guidelines. These are not things that are in the tools that help you balance way up a decision between a vaginal birth and having another caesarean. Now back to the Green Top guidelines again from the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. There's this really interesting paragraph. Cochrane, the Cochrane Library, Cochrane Reviews is internationally respected. They take research from all around the world and they examine how good the research is and what conclusions can be drawn or where there should be caution interpreting the results. And so this is a direct quote from the RCOG guidelines. The Cochrane reviews suggest that there are benefits and risks associated with a planned repeat caesarean or induction of labour with a previous caesarean, comparing that to vaginal birth. There is a paucity of randomised controlled trials. That means that there's few of them and they're not good quality. So there isn't really reliable evidence to help women make an informed choice. The related evidence for the established care pathways is potentially biased, which is what we've been talking about all this way through. So the care pathway, the care plan for women planning VBAC is potentially biased and is because it's drawn from non-randomized studies. So it says the results and conclusions should be interpreted with caution and the uncertainty should be discussed with women. So your obstetricians shouldn't be saying, oh no, you have to, because you have to be in hospital, you have to have be continually monitored because we know that shows better outcomes. They actually should be telling you, this is what we recommend, but there are issues with some of this research. And this is all evidence level A. Now we've had a chance to really look into this, and the thing is, the obstetricians and midwives, they're extremely busy, and sometimes they don't have time to read through all the guidelines fully, and they just take key points. So even though this is in the middle of the RCOG guidelines, they still make the same recommendations for the standard care pathway. But this is evidence level A, highest level. So what did it come down to? It basically comes down, it's up to you to balance the risks and the benefits. Think about, well, what are the actual risks? Which setting minimises them? What are the chances of something happening compared with the chances of other things? And how does I feel about that? And separate risk and chance, because risk is a really emotionally laden. You say, what is the chance that my baby and my uterus will rupture? Is a lot better than saying what's the risk of it rupturing. Let's have a look what the RCOG guidelines say about place of birth. They say that women should be advised that VBAC should be conducted basically in a labour ward with continuous monitoring, where you've got access to a theatre and neonatal resuscitation. Should we have a look what evidence level that is? Recommended best practice based on the clinical experience of the guideline development group, who are all obstetricians. So they haven't got any experience of doing it any other way. This is the lowest level of evidence. There's no academic research to back it up, no, not even case studies. But we've had a look, there is some research now that we can use, and that we know that home birth has better outcomes and doesn't increase issues for babies. So for some women, being in hospital will be the safest option, but there is no evidence for the blanket one-size-fits-all policy. I really hope this has given you a bit of confidence to consider home birth after caesarean, or perhaps you've already decided, and this will help you have a bit of confidence. This is a great article, Informed Consent and Refusal in Obstetrics. You can look it up. And this just compares planning a VBAC to going into space. The astronauts had, like I said, a 1.8% to almost a 2% chance of not coming back alive, yet a 98% chance of fulfilling the dream of a lifetime. We don't, the type and amount of benefit justifies the risk. We don't, shuttle astronauts face 40 times the risk that women and babies do planning a VBAC. Yet, they were not considered misguided. The astronauts were not considered misguided or psychologically incompetent. In contrary, they were among our society's highest achievers who competed for the opportunity to go to space. We accepted their autonomous choice to take the risk of achieving their dream. And it goes on to say, although physiologically normal birth lacks the glamour of spaceflight, it is important to many women. Do Google it, informed consent and refusal in obstetrics. So whose decision is it? It's yours. You have legal autonomy over your own body, including your baby. That's in the UK. You can accept or decline every appointment. So that includes appointments to see consultants. You do not need to see a consultant to get a home birth. And that is why you have a right to give birth at home, because you have to choose to go into hospital. So if you just decline to go into hospital, your default is to stay at home. A midwife, the trust cannot refuse to support your choice of home birth or refuse to send a midwife just because you're having a VBAC. They can send an ambulance if they don't have midwives. This is hugely up for debate, but there have been areas that don't have midwives. I mean, there's lots you can do to say, no, you're going to send me a midwife. You don't have to go into hospital if there's no midwives. But they can't say that your friend next door can have a midwife, but you can't because you're VBAC. It is offensive and incorrect for a health professional to insinuate that they have a greater interest in the well-being of your baby. And this does happen. They basically get told off for not thinking about your baby. I do suggest if that happens to you, you say, excuse me, could you please say that again so I can write it down? And then write it down. I find it highly offensive that you are saying that I'm not considering the well-being of my baby, and I will be taking this further. Hospital policy, and particularly because we know it's not clear-cut. Hospital policy is there to give guidance to health professionals. It's not the law. And coercion is not informed consent. These are really good charities that you can get support from. They have helplines, they have information. So Birthrights, AIMS, and Human Rights in Childbirth. And there are some great books that you can access through those organisations as well. I really recommend the AIMS VBAC book, Am I Allowed from AIMS? There's Vaginal Birth After Caesarean, written by Helen Churchill and wonderful obstetrician whose name's gone right out of my head. They're great books. And then Why Human Rights in Childbirth Matter by Rebecca Schiller. So how do you arrange a home birth? Right, you don't need to ask, I would like to have a home birth, is that okay? You just say, I understand, I've weighed it all up and I've decided I'm going to go for a home birth. And then you may well start coming out with different things. You go, that's fine, thank you, I have looked at it all. I really appreciate that. But I have looked at it all, and I'm going to go for a home birth. Thank you. I'm going to politely decline the appointment with the consultant to discuss it. I'm going to politely decline this, that, or the other. Thank you. I know. I will think about what you said, but I really at the moment, I'm definitely going for my home birth. Could you please write that down in my notes so I don't have to discuss it with anybody else? Yeah, thank you. I know, but it is my choice, and I'm going for home birth. Thank you. You have to sometimes be a bit persistent. You don't have to argue it. It's not your role to argue it. The emphasis on making sure that you're making informed consent is that they've given you the information. It's not, you don't have an obligation to prove that it's informed. Your decision is informed. It's your decision. If your midwife is not supportive, you can either ask for a referral to the head of midwifery or to the consultant midwife, or write to them yourself. Really consider hiring a doula, because they're just fabulous and increase your chance of avoiding a caesarean. But there are also local free support, so your local positive birth movement group, and they're around the world, your local home birth group, or maybe there's a natty birth woman like me. Again, contact PALS, contact AIMS, contact Birthright. In the UK, we have the PALS in every hospital, which is a patient, I think, advocacy and liaison service. And you can write again, send a letter, include copy to the chief exec. They don't like negative opinions of their hospital. Your MP and Beverly Beach AIMS, she's wonderful. Again, you do not need to see an obstetrician. You don't need to jump through any hoops. You don't have to have you have to have a scan this time, or you don't have to jump through hoops. If you are planning a home birth, these are some things, but talk to your local home birth group. And there's lots of pain relief available at home. A quick note about water birth. There are 2 issues with a VBAC and water monitoring, because you can't do continual monitoring when you're at home anyway, so it doesn't matter. Some hospitals, including some birth centres, will use wireless monitoring, but it is still continual monitoring, and it still has some of the issues around that, around the watching it, the fear, and it moving and not being able to pick up the trace. And the other issue is about getting you out should you be unwell. But lots of women could become unwell. Your chance, remember, of rupture is tiny. It is up to you to balance the risk and chance of these with the benefits of being in the water. And midwife who is unable to safely monitor you or care for you in this situation needs further training or support, because this is no different to a whole number of other situations where women still use the water. Any woman could become unwell in a pool. And there are midwives across the UK who support water birth for VBAC, so they consider it okay. So there isn't any reason why midwives caring for you shouldn't be able to do it. Birth at a midwife-led unit. Oh, this seems to be so difficult to get. There is a real postcode lottery. Some is because they want to preserve their statistics, some because they want to maintain being low risk. It won't be to keep them open, because having a midwife-led unit is a point for, they get points for it when they get inspected by the CQC. But it's daft, because women can really be between a rock and a hard place. You can be saying, oh, well, we really think you're too high risk to give birth in the midwife-led unit, but we'll support you for a home birth. So it's nuts. It also has a situation where women who accept that they want to be near a theatre, so they choose an alongside midwife-led unit, then they're near theatre should anything happen, but they're increasing their chance of having a caesarean. And they're told, no, you either have to go for one extreme or another. But if midwives are competent to care for you at home, then again, like with the water, they're competent to care for you in a midwife-led unit. However, sometimes if you're finding that they're not getting access to the midwife-led unit, saying that in that case I'll have a home birth can sometimes magically open the doors. I am supporting a current client who is going for VBAC and has chosen and is being supported for birth on a midwife-led unit. So it does happen. This is what birth rights have to say. Basically, it should be an individual, assessed on an individual basis and not a blanket ban. So if you're trying to get into a midwife-led unit, then do contact birth rights. Here we have some lovely stories now from women who planned home births. And you can see that they just happen. Women do have home births after vaginal birth. I like this one, and the consultant made a point of telling me that continual monitoring doesn't improve outcomes, and only increases the likelihood of repeat caesarean. And she said it helped me feel safe without being, in fact, she said I felt safer without being monitored because I didn't feel like I was going to end up with a caesarean for no reason. This is a lovely one. I got the midwives and consultants on board for the HBAC, which is home birth after caesarean, using assertiveness, and casually posed questions, pointed but casually posed questions to help these professionals question their own assumptions. This woman, she did lots of research. She did a freedom of information request, and there's a Facebook vbac UK group, and there's also a Facebook home birth after caesarean UK group. Sorry, my son's just come down. Oh, okay, thank you. Just go and get something. I'm doing this in the morning, so I didn't get this day, but he's come down now. This was lovely. Had a home birth after caesarean she had support from independent midwives. It's the most difficult, challenging thing I've ever done, she said. I couldn't have done it without them. It was a truly special experience I will treasure forever. And I didn't read the bit from the one above. Yes, I'd had a caesarean, but the percentage chance my uterus would be absolutely fine was way in my favour. So I didn't see a reason to get all twitchy about being in the pool. So just to summarise, uterine rupture is not a big as risk as other things that could happen to anybody. Continually monitoring is no better at detecting issues than intermittent monitoring, and increases your chance of having a caesarean. Your risk of your baby dying is the same as for any woman having her first baby. Planned home birth after caesarean is associated with a much higher chance of a straightforward birth, so planning a home birth. What I haven't got in here, just realising, is that the best outcomes are for planned vaginal births that end up in vaginal births. That is comparing those that are planned caesareans and those that are planned vaginal birth ending up in a caesarean. So planned vaginal birth after caesarean that ends up in a vaginal birth have the best outcomes, and that it is your body, your baby, so it's your choice. I really wish you well. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope everything goes well. Do find me on social media and give me some feedback and tell me your stories. This is a quote from a mum, that home birth is not just giving birth in a different environment, it's a completely different experience. And this is what you're balancing up. It is not just, it is so different. Honestly, believe me, so different. Go and enjoy your births. And know that if it doesn't work out, you put yourself in the best position for everything to go well. And often home births that transfer, you're looked after ever so well, because everybody thinks, oh, well, you're not getting the birth that you planned. But hopefully you will. And I love this quote from Sheila Kitzinger: far too many women, pregnancy and birth is still something that happens to them, rather than something they set out consciously and joyfully to do themselves. And this is a picture of my 5 lovelies, and my littlest one was born. Thank you very much. Goodbye.